Africa Lives on the BBC.
It's 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world it's time for Live Aid.
They called it the greatest show on earth. 58 bands across the globe playing live in a 16-hour music marathon. It raised millions for the starving in Africa and put governments around the world to shame. But it was the day they thought would never happen.
When they told me about it, I thought, what a terrible idea.
I burst out laughing. I said, don't be ridiculous.
Not least because its creator was an unlikely hero, a foul-mouthed fading pop star.
No, let's pop the address, let's get the numbers.
It didn't strike me as a man searching around, for a charitable role. Oh, is that a Live Aid, or I'll join the Citizens Advice Bureau?
Yet he became the people's champion.
He will never ever be able to lose the St Bob tag.
And the tormentor of world-class superstars.
You don't say no to Bob.
Ah, fucking that's it, Jesus Christ. Real good Irish passion coming at you.
And if he doesn't get you with the poetry, the spittle isn't far behind.
From the start, Live Aid was dogged by transatlantic rivalry.
America was horrendous.
Sabotage.
There was a spin put out. You're either being used, or people are going to make a lot of money off you, or it's not going to happen.
And superstar egos.
What the fuck do you think you're doing? I don't even speak to him. I'm not going to do it.
Many predicted catastrophe.
It looked like it would be a chaotic disaster.
Yet the skeptics would end up falling over themselves to get on board.
Let's not lie. Don't tell me there was one act there that wasn't aware that there would be more than 1 billion people watching.
It was a day many will never forget.
Everyone remembers where they were. Everyone remembers what they felt about it.
Everybody, it seems, except those who were there.
I think we went on first, didn't we? Yeah, it must have been
Great.
first. Yeah, because obviously it was still daylight, wasn't it?
Don't even remember that.
Did we go in a helicopter? Did we?
I just wish I could remember more than I can. But that's because, as I said, I had a bloody good time.
For 16 hours, the country was united with joy and reduced to tears. Against all the odds, it was the day that music changed the world. December 1984, and a now familiar anthem was taking Britain by storm. In Africa, an aid worker and a journalist heard the song for the first time.
Stupid song and a stupid name for it, and how dare this guy make money out of poor starving people in Ethiopia.
I thought it was crap. I thought it was trite. I just thought, what a load of drug-taking, cocaine-snorting, bonking pop singers got to do with all this. They're just doing it for their careers. The whole thing is bollocks, really.
I was busting my guts out to try and save these kids, and I thought somebody was taking advantage of them.
It wasn't true, but you could hardly blame them for being cynical. This was not a time of peace and brotherly love.
There was massive industrial change going on. The community I represented up in County Durham was basically losing all its old coal, steel industries, and so it was a big moment of change in the country.
Inner cities burst into flames. Unemployment was rife. Left-wing councils and the country's most powerful union, the miners, were locked in a fight to the death with Mrs. Thatcher's Tory government.
And there was no greater anarchist than Scargill. So was Derek Hatton in Liverpool. The madness of the loony left.
Arthur Scargill, for me, became a tune-out human being. If he came onto the TV, I just turned it off. If you saw police on horseback, you thought, they don't know what they're up against.
As far as the black community were concerned, We definitely felt that we were not a part of Thatcher's New Britain. We certainly got a sense that it was okay to be racist.
There seemed to be violence everywhere, and in football we had, of course, the violence, the football fans, that the whole country was on edge and everybody's, you know, knocking hell out of each other.
But some were doing very nicely out of Mrs. Thatcher. In the cocooned world of pop, it was limos, larger-than-life hair, and loads of money.
The weird thing about Mrs. Thatcher was that even though we hated her, we were all getting rich because of her.
I was earning lots of money. That was the time. It was the heart of Thatcherism. Those few years, there was a lot of me going on, and money was king.
Everything was larger than life. The shoulder pads were larger than life. The way that we drank and the way that we did things was excessive.
This was big hair, a go-go. Wow. The mullets and pop music had never felt so vapid.
One singer as well known for his bad hair and big mouth as his hit records was Bob Geldof, frontman of the Boomtown Rats.
I mean, I thought the Boomtown Rats were just crap, but, you know, and he can't sing.
By 1984, the hits and the money were drying up.
I was a fading pop singer, certainly fading, no longer relevant.
Dying on his feet. We got to a stage where we were thinking, well, we'll let him make one more record and we'll see how this goes.
I think we all felt he rather overstayed his welcome and shot his mouth off, and we felt to some extent, I think, that he was a pop star on the slide.
Geldof's girlfriend, Paula Yates, presenter of cult music show The Tube, was now the biggest star.
Bob occasionally hung around, you know, the dressing rooms and the canteen at Tyne's television when The Tube was being shot, like a big bad smell, and he always used to wear a big black leather coat and a hat just that said, you know, I'm a pop star, and he was so grumpy and horrible. I mean, everybody in Bob's world was a fucking bastard, you know, maybe with the exception of his partner and his daughter. So he wasn't that popular. People used to be very cruel to him, call him Mr. Paula Yates and everything, and I can see that hurt him.
But one autumn evening, Bob Geldof's life was about to change.
October makes me miserable anyway. Twilight makes me very uncomfortable. Around 4 o'clock, 4:15 on autumn days, or, you know, the orange sodium lights flick on. Don't like it. So I came in, so the time of day, the sense, though I wouldn't acknowledge it, that this was over, and the panic about what do I do, you know? I really can't do anything else in my life. Paula was in, and Fifi was in. She was just very small. The three of us watched the 6 o'clock news.
The news featured a report from famine-struck Ethiopia.
Dawn, and as the sun breaks through the piercing chill of night on the plain outside Coram, it lights up a biblical famine, now in the 20th century. This place, say workers here, is the closest thing to hell on earth.
The scenes were absolutely riveting. And this, from the get-go, did not look like television. It looked like Spartacus, something vast. And it was grey, these grey wraiths moving in this grey moonscape. And the camera was pitiless. It was like a cyclops. Just there, it would not let you off the hook.
The Red Cross have picked out 500 mothers and children out of the thousands and are treating them in an improvised shelter. It's run by an Anglo-Swiss nurse from Hertfordshire. She has to choose who amongst the hundreds who camp outside should be let in, which babies will be saved.
Hold on, what's this guy? What's that person doing there? That young girl in this horror, you know? What's Why does she have to decide who lives and dies?
I feel terrible because it's sending them to a certain death. It's terrible. I can take just what we can.
21 years on, the same nurse recalls her dilemma.
I tried to look at every child, but not stopping too much, because if you stop too much, they just used to throw the child at you. Or, plead too much, and that was heartbreaking for me. I think I marked their forehead or their hand with a piece of charcoal, the ones we took in, and we didn't take the worst ones, because the worst ones we knew they would die.
But making that decision day after day, does that do anything too?
Yes, of course it does. What do you expect? Yes, of course it does. It breaks my heart. It reminded me of a Nazi in a concentration camp, sending the people to the death camp. You can come in, you're okay, you're good, you're good, you're good, but you rest, you're going to die. It really, that's what I remember. I remember feeling so bad about the ones I couldn't help.
By Coram standards, it wasn't a bad night. 37 dead. Tomorrow, there would be more. The day after, more still.
The context of home, here we all were. Cosy. How do I keep this going? And cozy and this? Cozy and this?
It wasn't just Bob Geldof. The whole country was shocked.
People in Britain are donating about £100,000 a day to help the famine victims.
Relief agencies who are trying to cope with the famine have been inundated today with offers of help from the public. The Save the Children Fund alone received over 1,000 calls by midday.
I was just watching that Ethiopian thing. I think this is gross after coming out after seeing that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm serious.
A lot of people eating a lot of food. So you got any champagne?
Well, I've limited myself to 2 sausages and such.
Tortured by what he'd seen, Geldof hit upon an idea to raise money the only way he could, by making a record.
Did you fucking see that thing on TV last night? Did you fucking see that? And he was on the phone and he says, "You've got to do something about it. We've really got to do something about it." And you just, I was on the phone. I just said, "Yeah, absolutely. Whatever you say, Bob."
He got lucky. He roped in his friend, songwriter and producer Midge Ure from the chart-topping band Ultravox. To make it big, he needed big stars, but some of them were suspicious.
When Bob called me, I thought, he's the last person in the world who'd be talking about this kind of thing.
Is that the Chimes of Doom I pulled off?
I thought he was one of the greatest rock and roll stars ever. But the idea of past the plate was not something I'd associate with him. But he has, as you know, he's remarkable verbal skills, and if he doesn't get you with the poetry, the spittle isn't far behind.
It's 10:30, you lazy.
I was really suspicious when he first rang about Band-Aid. I was going, this is odd. Why would Geldof be doing this? There must be something in it for him.
You can't blame some of us for being mildly suspicious. Try and marry these two images of a man who cared desperately and passionately about starving people in Africa, and this other big, bad-tempered git who swore at everybody.
He's got this drive, this mad ambition to get this thing done.
Even further back than that, though, I think.
He's like a terrier. He will not let go. And once he had been let loose and got hold of all these artists, while I'm trying to put the record together, he's getting all the artists together, running up my telephone bill, I have to tell you. We both assumed the role, I was the producer, I was the guy dealing with the music. He was the guy rounding up the crowd.
There's no question, if Midge just let it all pass, that would have been the end of my involvement. And the record would not have been made without him.
Geldof and Midge Ure hope to raise £72,000 for Africa. But do they know it's Christmas surpassed their wildest dreams, making more than £8 million as it swept into the charts at #1. They set up a special trust to distribute the money.
And that was it. I thought it was all over then.
But it wasn't over. In fact, Geldof's journey was only just beginning.
I said to him, come out. We'll take you out there. I'll take you to where it's all happening. We'll have it all organised. Minimum number of days spent on it, but come and see it for yourself. Fuck off, he said.
What they said is, look, if we're to continue with this story, the editors don't want to know it's over for them. The only story now is Geldof being in Africa.
I phoned them the next day and said, have you had a chance to rethink where you're going? Oh, fuck off. And the next day, fuck off, I would see something in the diary, in the newspaper, Bob Geldof collecting money from Parlophone Records or whatever it was. Go along, Bob, fuck off, and went on like this.
While Geldof stalled, resentment about the Band-Aid Trust was gathering in unexpected quarters.
One of the surprising sources was the other charities. They saw us as a threat. They were very concerned that money which came to us was not going to go to them. And I said to Bob, it will be essential that you can demonstrate to the press and to the public who have given you all this money that you know the money's been well spent. And the only real way of doing that is to go out with the first cargo load and make sure you go from London right into the camps so that you can see that all the aid is properly distributed.
Geldof was wavering, but there was one sticking point.
Then Bob came on to me in the office and said, I'm thinking about this, but you know there'll be no fucking pictures of me with dead babies. Because that would, that's why I wanted him there. Not dead babies, but I wanted him there to show what was happening. I wanted him, beside a baby who was stick thin and stuff like that. Anyway, and I won't be going unless I get that promise from you. You are a dirty dealing. You're the man that ruins people's lives. You are not going to fucking ruin my life because I've got to make a living after this. I'm not a rich man. I don't have any money, but if I'm seen milking this for me, I am finished.
He's not a missionary. He's not a charity person. It's not his world at all. And he really was very frightened of what he would see, and he didn't want to go.
It's Christmas in Ethiopia, and the arrival of the pop star's flight from London was the focus of considerable curiosity.
A reluctant Geldof agreed to go on a whistle-stop tour of Ethiopia. The 9-day trip would take him to refugee centres and feeding camps in the areas worst hit by the famine. For the rock star, life was about to change, forever.
This scruffy git turned up with a pair of plimsolls, dirty pair of trousers, and I think it was the usual stripy jacket and tatty shirt, looking unwashed, with his bag slung over his shoulder, load of newspapers, and making some comment about a load of fucking journalists.
He was absolutely emphatic that this was not going to be a publicity tour as it could easily have been. That led to... Certainly the photographers were very worried about this because why were they there except to do precisely what Bob said he wasn't going to do?
The ultimate thing you can photograph as a photographer is life and death. And suddenly here was this opportunity of going to a country to cover a major story where people were dying. And as a photographer, that is one of the ultimate things you can cover. And I don't care what anybody says, but you get a buzz out of that knowing that you're going to be confronted with seeing death.
You're there watching an indeterminately aged human being. It looked like it was 2 years old, but it probably was 5 or 6 or 7, a huge distended head and eyes, saucer eyes, and flies settling on the mucus of the eyes, and they couldn't stand up, and they were listless in their mother or father's arms, and all they had to give them was a few grains of unhusked wheat, and they'd eat that, and it would be like razors in their stomach, so the child would begin to void its stomach, as well as not just the contents of the stomach. Pick up the baby, Bob.
He didn't stand any nonsense. He said, if you do that, he said, you're out, I won't talk to you. So we had to obey that directive to get cooperation with him. And I do remember filming him at one point when we were in Coram, and we were looking at the refugee camp, and he knew the cameras were behind him, and he was just staring in some shock at the scenes that he was seeing, and aware too that we were behind, and he suddenly turned away and expressed for the first time during that whole trip how upset he was. But he never went near to the kids. He didn't pick them up in our presence.
For the man who once said he wanted to get rich, famous and laid, this new life was mind-blowing.
You arrive at somewhere and you look out the window and there's a guard of honor, and you're going, stop this, and they all line up and they're all there. The lads are snapping to attention. So what do you do? I mean, literally, what do you do? What are you supposed to do when there's a guard of honor? So I find myself in this bizarre situation of remembering newsreels of Prince Charles or the Duke of Edinburgh, somebody looking at a guard of honor. I'll do that. I saw that in a newsreel. So you go along, you're looking at these guys who are looking at you, like these 18-year-old soldiers. They're looking, look at this scruffy cunt. Look at his filthy clothes, Look at the bags on it. He hasn't shaved for a week. And look at his stupid shoes. And I'm here presenting arms to this twat, But I've got to go along, and I wink at a couple of them, and they're kind of going, And next minute there's the minister or the general beside him coming along like this, And I'm going, I don't know how to convey how mad it is. I'm suddenly in this mad world, so unlike anything I've ever experienced. What am I doing here?
Geldof visited the remote village of Mekelle in Tigray. The area was swamped by tens of thousands of refugees fleeing the war in the north. On average, 40 people died from starvation every day.
We looked across this vast plain, and it was just covered with tent after tent, wigwam-type tents. And we were told there were over 100,000 people that had moved onto this plain that were dying, and they didn't have the food there to feed them. They just didn't have it, and they were just going to die. And it was all kind of in a beige colour. You just couldn't take it in.
And we came upon a little boy and a little girl. The little girl was one of my nightmares. The little girl was about 3 years old, and she was looking after her brother, who was about 1 year old. And the little boy was as close to death as you can be. His eyes were almost fixed, and he had that glassy, waxy look about a child who's about to die. And she continued to wave. She was in a pitiful state herself, but she continued to wave the flies away from around her brother's eyes. And the doctor explained that the little boy was unlikely to make it, but the little girl was in slightly better condition. And we moved up about halfway down the shed. This German nurse came up, spoke to the doctor, and said to the doctor, I don't know if it makes any difference to the photographer's picture of the little boy and little girl, but the little boy has just died. So Bob looked at me, and we moved up the shed. At the top of the shed, this nurse approached us again and said to the doctor, I don't know if it's going to affect your picture, but the little girl has now died. Anyway, Bob continued to talk to the doctor, and I left. And he came, found me. I'd gone behind this truck that was parked up nearby, and I'd been sick and just... It was an accumulation, but there was something just dreadful about it. And two of us... sorry.
I looked around and Kenny was bawling. And I think that moment of absolute reality just stripped away all that carapace, that hardened shell, and it got him.
So I retreated up the hill a little bit just to, do some general views of the area. And then the doctor emerged from a tent about 6 yards away with Bob, walking up the top end of McKaylee Camp, and the kids were just attracted to Bob, and they ran to be alongside him and look at him, the ones who could run. There was, and I thought, shit, that's a picture. I knew Bob would go nuts when I took it.
I just let it happen because I thought that would be real, because suddenly he'd stop being, come on, Bob, you know, we got... And suddenly there was no asking, there was no nothing. It just seemed the most natural thing in the world that this human being would take this picture. And I think that's the one and only picture.
The grueling schedule involved meetings with Ethiopian officials who didn't know what to make of the scruffy pop star.
You'd meet some kind of government official, and that was always, I suppose, not for me to say, but possibly better groomed than Geldof was. And you know, there were one or two occasions when the ministers would come over and sort of their hands outstretched to greet me, and I'm saying, no, it's not me, it's the tramp standing there.
But the dishevelled visitor tried to clean up his sartorial act for a face-to-face meeting with the Ethiopian ruler.
He knocked on my door at the Hilton Hotel that morning and said, Chris, he said, please, have you got another pair of shoes I can borrow? And I said, well, what do you want the shoes for? He said, well, just have a look at the state of mine. And I said, yeah, I know they're pretty awful, but you must have other shoes. And he said, no, he said, the only shoes I've got are carpet slippers. So I said, well, you know, this is obviously what you've got to do, Bob. Put the carpet slippers on. And he said, you bastard. He said, I know why you want me to put carpet slippers on. He said, you're going to film it, aren't you?
Bob Geldof's own feet seemed rather vulnerable. He wore carpet slippers, his shoes having fallen apart.
I didn't want to meet these guys anyway. We could have been out in the field, reports could have been going back to the UK, I could have been talking to the people working on the ground, I could have been getting... Said I had to do this bollocks. I didn't ask for it. And we were all starving, and, you know, and I think food showed up, and I was pacing, and I was getting more and more worried about the meeting. Two, that we were there at all, and some geezer showed up.
Bob just stood there and went, and how dare you keep us fucking waiting while all these people are starving and we're not even seeing the president. We're seeing, you know, the dog's body, as it were, you know.
Okay. So I'd meet the president, I'd get out my amnesty report, because I always had the amnesty report. He is a thug. He murders 60 people a day, he tortures them. So I'd say, says here that you torture people, you know, because it's quite interesting, frankly, meeting a murderer and a torturer. I thought, this guy's a prize cunt, so I just said, you know, I think you're a cunt.
I wonder how the translator put that into Amharic.
The interpreter had stopped interpreting.
You just thought, yes.
I was eating peanuts at the time. I thought, I better eat a lot of these, because when you have a jail here, they don't feed you very regularly. And I thought, God, we're in trouble.
Luckily for Geldof and his party, the insult was apparently lost in translation, and the trip was drawing to a close.
I'd spent the money. I'd lived up to my responsibility by going there, and the crew's following me, and that kept that reported back to the Band-Aid generation, if you like. Here you are, here's the people who will benefit from your largesse. Here's how it's been done. This is what's happening now. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
But Geldof was about to embark on the next phase of his strange journey.
In Ethiopia, an acute shortage of transport is still hampering the distribution of food aid, and while the supplies lie in the port, they're at the mercy of the weather.
It wasn't moving because a cartel operated in the docks of trucks, and they were charging a ridiculous price to shift the food. And I said to someone, well, you know, there should be an alternative fleet of trucks. And they said, there isn't one. How much does that cost? About £3.5 million.
Geldof left Ethiopia, haunted by the images of the past 9 days. He'd bullied the cream of the music world and insulted an African dictator. Now he got the chance to tackle the powers that be at home.
Bob turns up looking like he'd been sleeping in the nearest park bench overnight. Unshaven, hair standing on end, looking for trouble. And Bob, before anyone could get to him to ask him why he was there, strode across the hall, and I was with him, and I said, "Mrs. Thatcher, there's someone I think you'd like to meet, Bob Geldof." And she said, "Ah."
And she said, "How do you do?" You know, and all this sort of thing. And I said,
I mean, at the moment you've got a problem with the butter mountain. You don't know how to dispose of it. To sell to the Russians is the cheapest way.
I'm sorry, but butter doesn't do very much good in Africa.
Well, butter oil actually does. It is one of the major supplementary
butter oil,
foods.
if you can get it.
But it is a byproduct of butter.
I was pressed up very close to her. So she's quite small and I'm relatively tall, so I was looking down and she sort of had to go like this.
A lot is going. A lot of surface food is going. But don't
Prime
forget...
Minister, there are millions dying, and that's the terrible thing.
Difficult to tell who was lecturing who.
Geldof became the people's champion.
Suddenly I was this figure, which sort of hadn't sunk in really yet. And it was seen as a big confrontation with the Prime Minister.
One of these great moments when Maggie, the great, wonderful Maggie Thatcher, was brought down to that size because she was wrong.
That's what he did so brilliantly. He just stood up and said, "This is wrong."
And still today, it's like, you know, moments cab drivers remember. I'll remember that time you told Facky that to fuck off. God me, I'll fucking remember that. Well, I didn't.
At a time of great political change, the punk and the Prime Minister had more in common than anyone realised.
She lashed out with her handbag at every institution she saw: the monarchy, the old Tory party, the old Labour Party, the trade unions. She was a punk.
Back then, it wasn't exactly cool to support Mrs. Thatcher.
Highest standard of living ever. Highest output. Highest investment. Highest retail sales. Highest ownership of houses. Please, will you remember that sometime?
But secretly, many, like Geldof, admired her policies. Privatised industries ignited the share-buying dream. Council house tenants bought up their own homes. And in the city, young guns were making a killing.
There was a great deal of prosperity about, and we were seeing the beginnings perhaps of, was it Cortina Man in those days?
A lot more people in this country felt that they were budding capitalists. Guess what? We bought our council house, you know, paid rent for 350,000 years. We're homeowners. We actually can do it now. We've got shares.
You're all being told that to go out and make money. You know, if you're an 18-year-old kid, just make money. It's cool to be 18 and have a Porsche and wear, you know, red braces and have these new mobile phones which were the size of a backpack and stuff. That's cool. You know, I actually think it is cool.
Geldof had become a charity entrepreneur, and Mrs. Thatcher loved entrepreneurs.
I think what they were doing was almost a sort of privatisation of aid. It was very much a return to a sort of 19th century idea of philanthropy and of people spontaneously taking an initiative to help other people rather than relying on or expecting the state to do it for them.
Even in the home of capitalism, the cream of America's music talent was jumping on Geldof's bandwagon. 45 top stars were about to record their own charity single for the famine.
I was quite moved at the fact that a bunch of Brits got together, you know, and decided to do this. I think that's what really kind of woke us all up in America.
There comes a time.
The two superstars of the moment, Lionel Richie and Michael Jackson, wrote the song, and Richie's manager, Ken Cragen, invited Geldof to come to Los Angeles for the recording.
There are people dying.
Well, I'd never spoken to Bob Geldof before. I didn't really know what I was in for.
At the Band Aid recording in London, the talent had gone to the local chippy for their dinner. But in California, they did things differently.
I got, I don't know, $50,000 worth of free food donated for the group, and then it was all spread out.
It was in Hollywood, California. So when you say, would any restaurant like to cater for free? Well, it's only going to be Spago's, it's only going to be Chasen's, and their presentation is going to be over the top.
Geldof was not impressed.
The only problem with that is Bob walked in, saw it, and started berating the people for eating while the people were dying in Africa.
It was a little egregious, like, you know, I think the caviar, the lavishness of it.
It was a little embarrassing. I had to go retrieve Bob and get him back to the studio.
We Are the World raised $45 million across the globe, 4 times as much as Band Aid.
They'll always say to you, oh, you're the guy who did We Are the World, and I go, no. You know, but, you know, whenever I walk into a bloody room in Africa, we are the world. No, wrong song.
The money-making potential of a huge gathering of top-class talent would stay with Geldof. 2 months before, he'd been written off as a fading star, hell-bent on his own publicity. Now, he was the man on a mission, the conscience of the nation.
They started to call him Saint Bob.
He slipped from the rock star persona into the Saint Bob persona very easily.
They stopped calling him a musician or a singer. They always referred to him regarding his charity work rather than his musical work, and that was kind of sad because we were still a band, we were still a working band.
People would come up and, hello Bob, how are you, how's it going, is everyone okay over there now, how's it all going, and would thrust money at him and rings and everything.
I wanted this to stop now. I mean, it was already beyond any control I had.
So, ladies and gentlemen, for tonight's special award, Bob Geldof and Midge Ure, please come forward.
But Geldof was the face and the voice of Band Aid, and the story everyone wanted. And his unique force of character came at a cost to those close to him.
He was awful in these award ceremonies. He would literally just go and get the award, say, thanks so much, don't know where I'd be without you, you know, you've saved people, thanks so much, bye. Leaving Midge with no award and nothing, to just stand there going, yeah, you know.
And Midge Ure.
We both went up to pick up the award, and Bob, in his usual manner, launched into this huge speech.
I'll say something.
Leaving me standing behind him again, 3 feet behind him, looking a bit kind of dazed and confused.
Why wouldn't he want Midge to share the awards and the glory and the credit for doing what they did? Why does the rest of the world think it's just Bob's baby? Why did Bob allow that to happen?
It was a classic Geldof, he doesn't mean it, it's just he's there, and he was launching at this big thing about the whole Band Aid, Live Aid thing and whatever, but it's just how he is.
He had the awards and he had the acclaim, but old suspicions began to resurface. Some reporters were openly hostile.
Fortuitously, but not by design, the success of Geldof and Band Aid has brought new life to the sagging popularity of the Boomtown Rats. It has earned the group criticism that they're cashing in on Geldof's Ethiopian philanthropy, even that his obsession with fundraising has become sanctimonious.
Thing is that if they say, oh, what a publicity stunt, I mean, it is frankly ridiculous. I don't work 20 hours a day on publicity stunts.
Tonight, the Rats will hold a concert in London and can reflect that while they never planned it, the ill wind from Africa has certainly done them some good.
But had it? The rest of the Rats certainly didn't think so.
Suddenly on this tour, 80-year-old ladies were coming up and says, "Hiya, Bob, here's £20. It was good, but it was strange, We were trying to be a rock and roll band, We don't want your mum to like us.
That tour was wildly different because the old buckets would have gone around, or they were at the exits. So, like, you know, we come in, and everyone's job. I mean, so I promise you, in the band, we'd have to divvy up the buckets and count the money.
The Band-Aid buckets raised £50,000, much more than the band was making on its record sales.
We would leave the venue, get on the tour bus, all the buckets would be piled onto the tour bus and they'd be down the centre aisle. And rather than the usual sort of rock and roll like Jack Daniels and telling wild stories, we'd all be there counting. That's another £500. You count the coins, and the whole band would be sitting there till about 2 o'clock in the morning, counting all this money. And this would happen every night.
Pathetic, you know. Where were the babes? You know, why didn't they count them? You know, didn't happen.
I was a Boomtown Rats fan. Yeah, I really, really liked them as a band. And in fact, I saw the Boomtown Rats at university and was annoyed at how many thousands of people wanted to get in to see them because I had been a fan. But of course, people were there to worship at the shrine of St. Bob, and rightly so. Rightly so, he'd done such an incredible thing. But I was annoyed because I'd been there at the beginning.
It was the end of the road for the Rats, and Geldof bowed to the inevitable. Since his visit there, Ethiopia had never been far from his thoughts. Now he had a brainwave.
Bob came in one day and said, look, we have to break this trucking cartel, but we haven't got enough money. And we all kind of went, oh, okay. He said, I've got this idea.
We were going to do a concert. Now, Bob, in his way, this wasn't a consultation with the trustees. This was a statement of fact. This was going to happen. And I think we all were scared.
We all sat there kind of going, huh?
But Geldof couldn't do it alone. He needed someone as bolshy as himself to get the job done. Harvey Goldsmith was the biggest promoter of the day. What's more, this tough music industry bruiser had the mouth to match Geldof's own.
I actually basically told him to fuck off at first because I just thought he was being ridiculous.
I mean, he actually did say, you're fucking mad.
But Geldof wouldn't take no for an answer.
The phone rang, and there he was, saying, got to see you today, got to get this concert together. And I said, I'm just unpacking, I've just got off the plane from China, I don't know where I am, let's talk tomorrow. Got in the office, I think I've been there about 6 minutes, phone rang, Bob again. I said, okay, let's meet. Wanted to do a big concert at Wembley, lots of big acts, and rattled off the A to Z of that time, every major act there was, and said they're all doing it. And I just looked at him and said, yeah, very funny.
And he says, what do you mean, one concert, two continents? Why do you do that?
Basically, everything he said he wanted to do, I said, you can't. So that was our starting point.
So, it's a nightmare you're going to have in the middle of the summer where they're already booked up. But like he kept saying, and then what are you going to do then? And then what? And you could see he kept asking a question.
In the back of my mind, I actually knew it was possible, but I didn't want to tell him that.
We're scared of Bob. We're scared of Geldof.
Now he just needed the talent, and for them, there was no safe hiding place.
And he just approached me in the middle of Heathrow Airport. I don't think he was going anywhere. I think he was just sort of there haranguing people. Scared the crap out of me, so I said yes.
And he was angry and committed and very volatile, and so I just went along with it. You know, you don't say no to Bob Geldof very easily.
We're scared of Bob.
What did you say to Bob? No? Do you know anyone that said no to Bob?
You don't say no to Bob. I thought it was such a great idea that, of course, I said yes immediately.
But not everyone saw it as a golden opportunity.
When he said to me what he was trying to do, I burst out laughing. I said, don't be ridiculous.
I must admit, when they told me about it, I thought, what a terrible idea. I thought, God, a big gathering of all those whalers, and it was the 80s, remember, there was so much crap around. I thought, oh God, it'll be all them, you know, all pouncing around in their white trousers.
So you'd say, oh, well, it's in July sometime, not quite sure where it's going to be. Don't know if it'll be on the telly. And by the way, you can only probably play for about 20 minutes. You won't get a contract, but we want you on the TV. And you have to pay for it all yourselves. And it was like, fuck off.
And as if that wasn't enough, Geldof was to boldly go where no man or television station had gone before. An all-day transatlantic live TV extravaganza when satellite technology was still in its infancy. Only one man could make it work. Geldof flew to New York to see Mike Mitchell, who had just produced the television coverage of the LA Olympics.
He and I discussed what it is that he wanted to accomplish. And when I went there, I was very skeptical. He had originally wanted to do a concert between London and New York. I had just come off the Games and said I really wasn't interested in that, but if you want to do a worldwide event, I'm in.
They called it the Global Jukebox, and it was getting bigger by the minute. Wembley would start at noon. America would join in 5 hours later. The shows would be beamed all around the world via satellite, with other countries joining in. It was a round-the-clock operation.
I took my little house and we moved in desks and we ordered more telephone lines, and we simply just worked out of that house for the show. And I couldn't even go to the bathroom during the day. That's how bad it was.
America was the leading expert in the satellite technology that Geldof needed for the Global Jukebox. So everything hinged on getting the American show right. Harvey Goldsmith pinned his hopes on the legendary West Coast promoter, Bill Graham.
Bill Graham was an irascible, angry, difficult control freak, and you either did it his way or you didn't. He also was an amazingly creative guy, and he really put music on the map in America.
You know, Bill was an imposing figure. He always ruled by intimidation. He was as tough promoter as has ever been produced on the history of the planet, I would imagine. You know, he was a bad motherfucker.
Graham's sidekick and fall guy was fellow promoter Larry Magid.
Everything about Bill was drama. You knew that there was going to be a timed explosion at some point, and it became part of the ritual with Bill.
So far, Geldof and Goldsmith had few stars on board, no venue in America, or even at that point a broadcaster in either country. All they had was the bluff of Bob.
And then they could say, great, we took part in the biggest TV broadcast ever, now f*** off.
One of the very early impossibilities that Bob threw at me was that he wanted to put this out on TV. And he then said, I want the whole concert on TV. And I said, that ain't gonna happen.
There was only one organisation that could pull it off. Good old Auntie.
You simply couldn't believe that you'd bring together Queen, U2, Paul McCartney, you name it. I mean, you know, Rod Stewart, yes, he'll be there too. Phil Collins, oh, he'll be in Concord. All this was sort of, it was being told me, and I was sort of saying, yes, that's all, you know, that's really interesting. But I didn't believe it, to be honest.
Bob thumped the table and said, no, I want the whole show out, all 12 hours of it, and we're going to do America, so I want that out as well. I want the whole day sorted out, and he just stormed out the room.
I just assumed they would. So why not? And I suppose it's sort of that naivete. It didn't strike me as that big a deal.
And then suddenly, Bob walked in the door again, and he said, I want an answer by Tuesday. He shot out the door.
I've been having second thoughts about this, and I'd like to hear more from the music department about the idea.
Well, what exactly do you want?
Well, it'll be mainly music, George. Well, frankly, to me, this savours too much of a gimmick. I'm in favour of the experiment.
For 2 weeks, Geldof and Goldsmith held their breath. Then finally, a breakthrough.
I called Bob and said, I just had a call from Roger and he thinks he might be doing it. He said, good, is he going to do the whole lot? OK wasn't good enough. It was the whole ball of works or nothing.
With only 6 weeks to go before transmission, the news was broken to BBC staff.
Bearing in mind it was the height of the summer and most of the outside broadcast vehicles were already booked for other things, you've got all sorts of sporting activities going on. I thought that it's going to be an absolute nightmare.
The biggest misgivings were voiced by the team who had the unenviable task of presenting the show. The men behind the Anorak's favourite music programme from the late-night graveyard slot, The Whistle Test.
I was on holiday, in fact. I remember putting down the telephone and going out and lying in the meadow outside the house and staring up at the sky and just feeling nauseous with terror.
The thing you have to remember about Whistle Test is that we were a very humble little programme. We were 40 minutes once a week, occasionally, on BBC Two. And here we were doing one of the biggest shows the BBC had ever done. It was like asking BBC Radio Clec Heaton to do the Olympic Games. You know, we really weren't up to it.
If that wasn't enough of a problem, the new boy on the show was ideologically opposed to the whole thing.
I could see that whilst it was a worthy gesture by a number of pop stars, there had to be behind it something more substantial to back it up. I wanted the governments to do something about it. They're the people who had the real power.
Geldof had his work cut out, getting the European networks on board.
I talked to them from the very beginning about this, and the precondition for any of the wealthier Western countries is that they run a telethon. Iceland don't want to do a telethon.
Geldof's global jukebox dream wasn't going to plan. America's can-do culture was rapidly becoming can't-do. The nation that put a man on the moon didn't believe that this show was technically possible.
We were literally laughed out of all three networks' offices. The Olympics, we used 2 satellites, 1 feed, 1 location to a world feed. Live Aid, 16 satellites, 8 locations, all interactive feed for 16 hours. In today's terms, it would be like saying, let's do a concert on the moon.
After weeks of wrangling, ABC finally agreed to broadcast not the whole day, but a 3-hour special with Philadelphia as the American venue. They had the venues and the TV networks, but few stars confirmed. Geldof and Goldsmith had no choice. They had to go public.
We had a press conference at Wembley to announce the whole thing, which was a bit of a farce, really, because we actually didn't have anybody confirmed at that point at all.
We were scribbling names down as Bob was going, because we had to go at 12 o'clock, I seem to remember, on Radio 1.
Richard Skinner here talking to you live from Wembley Stadium, where a very important announcement is about to be made.
Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to announce today that as Band-Aid's first part of their relief programme comes to an end, and as our younger sister, USA for Africa, begin their relief programme today, Band-Aid start the second part of their programme by announcing Live Aid. The people taking part in alphabetical order will be Bryan Adams, Adam Ant, the Boomtown Rats, David Bowie, the Cars.
Most of the press conference was spent with bits of paper flying about from various different people, to Bob, back to Bob, to Bob, to Bernard and so on, and from me saying, no, this hasn't confirmed, and he would just be flicking them off the table.
I would have been flicking it away because it would have been a distraction, because it was going to happen. It was going to happen that Mick was going to somehow square things with Keith, and that was all going to happen, and Bob Dylan was going to show up, and it was going to be wonderful. That was in my head. There wasn't a second's doubt as I did it, but afterwards I'd be sick with fear.
Queen's
Sade,
manager, Jim Beach, suddenly interrupted the proceedings.
Spandau Ballet.
I suddenly got yanked out. It was Jim Beach calling from New Zealand. And he said, what the hell's this all about? He said, why are you announcing Queen? I said, because Bob told me they were doing it. And he said, what? So I said, look, we're right in the middle of the press conference. He said, you better not announce Queen. I coughed a bit and said, because he'd already done it.
The Pretenders, Queen.
Bands who were no longer together were amazed to hear they were reforming, especially for Live Aid.
Status Quo.
I got a call from Pete Townsend just as they were going into the press conference that I thought sort of intimated to me that he was at least interested in playing. Not with The Who, but he was interested in playing.
Marsha came in with her bit of paper to say that Pete Townsend agreed to do it. Threw it at Bob. Bob read it and announced that The Who were getting back together again.
And about 5 minutes ago, we heard some wonderful news, and that is that The Who, one of the greatest bands ever in rock music, are reforming specifically for this event.
What the fuck are you talking about? It was just really bizarre. It was really, really bizarre.
The phones light up completely mentally from the pair of them. What the fuck do you think you're doing? I don't even speak to him. I'm not going to do it.
I think you will agree that we have more or less, without a doubt, in fact, the most important people over the last 20 years. And I can also tell you that the remaining half dozen or so huge bands in the world are at the moment trying to clear their desks, and we will let you know over the next 3 weeks who's in and who's out of that remaining half dozen.
I went through the list, and like literally the journalists were sort of gasping, have you got so-and-so? Yes, yes, and they were kind of freaking out. And I said, Brian Ferry, so-and-so. Next minute, like the phone rang about 2 hours later, Brian said, I never agreed to do it. And I said, well, hey, dude, pull out.
As the Wembley press conference made clear, Geldof's brusque, domineering personality was driving Live Aid forward while pushing old friends aside.
It was becoming very obvious that Midge was being pushed into the background. So Bob said, OK, then, well, I'll read one band out and Midge can read the other, and so on and so on.
Richard Skinner here talking to you live from Wembley Stadium, where a very important...
I tuned into Radio 1, all sort of excited that at last Midge was going to get, his due for doing so much work and get to be a part of things again. And I sat and Bob just did the whole... It was as if Midge wasn't there.
On 2 continents. I'll read out the list of people taking part.
The conference kicked off without me. I felt a bit miffed. I was a bit left out. I was standing talking to Gary Kemp and Adam Ant. Before I knew it, a kind of partition had been closed and the press launch was happening next door. So there's the entire Band Aid trustees all sitting there with Bob spouting off about who he was going to get. And I was in with them and I'm thinking, hold on a second, what's happened to me? Where have I gone?
Well, I mean, he had nothing to do with Live Aid. I mean, that's it. That's the reality of it. And I would have said, well, if he wants to do something, he can, but it was never suggested to me, and I would have thought it redundant, really.
I know it's not about egos, and it's not about personalities, but I think it was quite hard for Midge to take. And to his credit, he never said anything publicly.
Despite bruised egos behind the scenes, all pop fans cared about was that the biggest concert in history was going to happen in just 4 weeks.
The people taking part in alphabetical order will be Bryan Adams, Adam Ant, the Boomtown Rats,
I'm just waiting for the K's to come along, and it said, Nick Kershaw, and I'm there.
Judas Priest, Nick Kershaw, Chris Christopherson, Huey Lewis and the News.
I mean, I wouldn't go if it was just the Wurzels, and it was the Wurzels and Bucks Fizz, I wouldn't bother.
Coming here for the music or for the charity?
For charity and the music. It was a thrill to be able to go back to the Polytechnic and go in with this ticket and say, we've got one, we've got one, we've got one.
I
stayed on the phone for hours
Did you?
while it was
Ages.
engaged, like about 4 hours, just ringing, putting it down, ringing, putting
I
it down.
got through
until I
after
got through.
4 hours, that's all it took. With my mum's credit card.
That's right.
God bless her.
The tickets sold out in minutes, but one fruit and veg seller in Cheshire decided to do something a bit more ambitious.
The Live Aid concert will be the biggest televised event the world has ever seen. Now, in Wembley Stadium, there'll be 2 giant television screens, which will be receiving the American end of the concert live by satellite. There's only one other vast television screen, mobile, in the country, and that won't be at any stadium. No, that'll be right here, in this field at Pot Shrigley, near Bollington, in Cheshire.
I'd got the biggest screen in Europe, this bloody big screen, and nowhere to put it. And anyway, Ches Orme, local lad, local farmer, he said, do it on my field. And it went from like a small little idea to something quite large, really.
Geldof had the date, the venues, the satellites, and now the audience, but still, no lineup.
You would think now, looking back, the greatest show on earth. Every artist in the world must have clamoured to play at Live Aid. That wasn't the case whatsoever. It was the exact opposite. There were many, many artists who needed a great deal of convincing, and managers who were sceptical that it would take place and it would be first class and it would show their artist in a good light and that it was real, that it would actually take place. And so Bob would use bluff and bluster and outright porky pies. He'd phone one artist, for example, he'd phone Elton and say, Queen and Bowie are in. And then he'd phone Bowie and say, Elton and Queen are in. And they weren't in. He was making it up.
The best way is to make them feel threatened by their peers. So it gets to the point, if you're not on it, well then, who are you in the hierarchy? So if you've got Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, David Bowie, Bob Dylan, who the fuck are you that you're not doing it?
For bands who had split up, like Status Quo, Geldof played the role of marriage counsellor.
He said, nobody's interested in doing it, he can't get anybody to... And he said, we're not happening, we're unrehearsed, and he said, it doesn't matter a fuck what you sound like as long as you're there. He could have said, we really need you guys, you're great, but he didn't.
Live Aid still needed the supergroups of the age. Suddenly, a breakthrough.
I simply looked down at my date sheet and I noticed that we were playing a 12-night run at Wembley Arena across that period. And when he said the date was July the 13th, 1985, I noticed that we were playing at Wembley Arena on July the 13th, 1985. And I literally said to him, well, we'll just walk across, which is what we did, and we'll do the performance. And then as long as we can have a time slot where we can get back to play to the 12,000 odd people who I hoped at that point were going to buy tickets for our show.
The only thing I do remember thinking was whether in fact we'd be able to get it done in time and not to be able to get back and do the other gig.
Several other managers subsequently rang me and said, are you doing this show at Wembley? Do you think X should do it?
It was an accident of timing that proved a critical breakthrough.
Ringing for you.
People actually started calling up and saying, well, you know, we're doing a show, we'd like to be on at 6 o'clock, right? Well, I said, okay, but you're doing the show bit's good enough, right? Could we just do the billing bit later? And of course, you know, Radio Bicknell had told everybody what time he was on, right? So they're all scrabbling now, because naturally you're a manager and you say, my act's going to do this thing, you know. What's the next thing? You want to get the best bit on the bill.
Before Dire Straits said yes, bands would do anything to get out of doing Live Aid. Now there was a mad rush to get in.
Are we on while America is watching? You know, that was probably a question coming from my office to the promoters and to Geldof as to what time of the day we went on. There was a bit of jostling that went on during the run-up to the show.
No, I wanted to do it, you know, because it was an important thing to do.
I remember at the time it was really frowned on if you said, oh, it would be good for our career. So no one ever kind of mentioned that anyway. It was all kept kind of underneath.
You knew how important it would be, not just for the cause, but for your own career.
I've read some criticism about people saying, well, they just did it because they wanted publicity. None of us needed publicity.
It's not lie, you know, you think things, it's a wonderful cause and it was a wonderful day for the music business, but don't tell me there was one act there that wasn't aware that there would be more than 1 billion people watching.
Yes, I'm lucky, yes, I'm lucky.
But Geldof's idol, Mick Jagger, still hadn't taken the bait, even though Geldof had been stalking him for weeks.
Keith, and all that. So he said it'll be a nightmare, he said, but, I'll do it.
Mick Jagger agreed to perform in America without the Stones, but then he and his mate David Bowie had another brainwave, a transatlantic duet.
At one point, I was going to do my part of the song in England, and Jagger was going to be in the States doing his part over there.
I said, how do we do that? He's in, you're in America, he's here.
But we couldn't find anybody who was fully convinced that we could actually sing at the same time and make it work everywhere. So we abandoned that idea anyway.
He said, well, can't we do something with a spaceship? And there was this whole argument going on about which of them was going to be sitting in the rocket singing. I actually made a call to NASA. So we got any rockets going up? We'd like one to put Mick Jagger on. And I could imagine, go, who's this nutcase? What?
The space shuttle was abandoned in favour of something more down to earth.
I genuinely didn't know that they were going to go off to a studio and do Dancing in the Street, which is, so apt. And then knocked off a video, which is hilarious, these two sort of old queens trying to out-camp each other, really. And it went to #1 and the money came to us.
As the cast list got longer, the tabloids lapped up every detail. But the serious music fans' Bible remained more po-faced.
The NME was really steeped in what we'd now call an indie kind of attitude, in which anything to do with the mainstream is probably bad. Anything that is deeply unpopular is probably good. Live Aid was perhaps the most mainstream event which any of us had ever seen, actually, in our lives. And it was therefore hardly a very cool thing to attach one's self to.
The black press was even more critical, furious at what it saw as the deliberate exclusion of black British artists. The Voice newspaper called it the Band-Aid blacklist.
Yet again, somehow we weren't part of what was going on in the country. Of course a lot of people felt pissed off, a lot of people felt as though, fuck you, here it goes again.
As this was a concert for famine relief in Africa, perhaps 1 or 2 Africans, maybe valid and valuable additions to the lineup. Oh, no. You can't have any of that.
A journalist who suggests there should be more black performers on the bill at Wembley gets short shrift.
Thanks, mate. We don't need someone to pull a crowd. We need to get money to stop people dying. And I don't care if they're orange, luminous pink or green. The object is to stop people dying.
Political correctness, thank God, wasn't that terrible at that time. So we didn't have to have a one-legged lesbian and all the rest of it. We were just putting a show together.
Geldof did want the black American stars of We Are the World, but most of them didn't want to know.
We went to all of the major black acts who were popular at that time, and they all said no. But we couldn't explain that to people. We had this unbelievable discussion with Michael Jackson's people saying this is to help people in Africa. He just wasn't interested.
In America, there was an agenda, or that was in a way bought from their Band-Aid record of that community of black acts committing or not, and it was like a block vote. And unfortunately, the block vote sort of went against the Philadelphia show from the black artist community.
The Wembley concert was finally falling into place, but the all-important American end was falling apart.
After lunch, bad news. Promoter Harvey Goldsmith has received a 4-foot-long telex from the American organisers of the Philadelphia concert.
With just 3 weeks to go, there were few confirmed acts in the American bill, and the erratic promoter Bill Graham had stopped returning Geldof's calls.
America was horrendous, and I was in a complete panic. I wouldn't show it, but like I really did not sleep about America because we weren't kept in touch, and you know, and Harvey and I went there, and it was a mess. I mean, it was a mess when we went into the office, and Bill Graham was rude and superior and very distracted.
Bob thought Graham would go out and secure performers, and that's not what he did. We put a team together. We literally picked up the phone and just started calling people, and Graham wasn't really participating in that.
Rumours now reached London that Graham was actively undermining the show he was supposed to be promoting.
We were hearing from some artists that he was telling them behind our backs that the show wouldn't take place and that it wasn't well organised and they shouldn't participate and it would damage their careers. And he, in fact, put some artists off.
Paul Simon pulled out because of Bill Graham's behaviour, and Paul called me. I can't do it, man. I'm not on a star thing, he said, but I just can't put up with this behaviour, you know, from Graham. He's just rude and insulting. So I was going...
America was rapidly slipping down the drain. Without the US show, there would be no satellite link-up and no global event. Goldsmith's sidekick, Pete Smith, was sent to America to whip Bill Graham's ass.
He said, this show can't happen. And he said, do you see all those bits of paper on my desk? I said, yeah, I've been looking at those. He said, well, those are all of the artists, you know, that could play at Philadelphia, you know, the American artists. And I said, so? He said, I refuse to work with half of these people. He's quite a bullish guy, right? So, me being the optimist, I said to him, well, there's a lot of bits of paper. What about the other half? And he looked at me and said, they refuse to work with me.
It wasn't just the stars who had a problem with Bill Graham. His relationship with the TV producers reached crisis point.
The television people would come in and they would have a little meeting with us, and it would always end in Bill yelling at them.
He was doing a concert, and we were doing a television show. So there was a conflict, and his personality is such. He's theatrical, he's dramatic, and so we didn't work together well.
It didn't resolve itself. They hated each other. I got custody of Bill.
Geldof and Goldsmith threatened to sack Bill Graham.
I was piggy in the middle. That's exactly what I was. I was right smack in the middle, and there wasn't anything to do but keep these two people from killing each other.
And as if all this bad blood wasn't enough, chart-topping band Huey Lewis and the News suddenly pulled out.
Mysteriously, we would get withdrawals. And that's when we dug into it and found, as I said, there were interest groups who were calling artists, actually telling them not to participate.
So far, a few stars from the record We Are the World had come on board.
In a nutshell, they didn't want to be superseded, I don't think, USA for Africa, by something they thought was in effect a Band-Aid enterprise.
It looked like it would be a chaotic disaster.
There was a spin put out that that's what was going on. You're either being used, or people are going to make a lot of money off you, or it's not going to happen. And so there was this game played for about 4 to 5 weeks, up until literally the week or so before the event, of people in or out.
Back in Britain, Geldof's lineup was almost complete. But as usual, he wanted more. One of the icons of the age, Princess Diana.
There must be an angel playing with my heart, yeah.
Tonight, the Prince and Princess arrived back in London to attend a concert by the pop group Dire Straits. Tonight's performance is being given in aid of the Prince's Trust, a charity particularly associated with the royal couple.
Geldof managed to get a free ticket from somebody, because he certainly wouldn't pay, and showed up and kind of corralled them in the corner and talked them into coming along to at least the opening of the Live Aid show.
I thought it would be important that they came because at that time, you know, it was glamorous, there was the excitement around their relationship and stuff like that. And they represented, well, the country.
He had royalty, and now Geldof wanted pop royalty. But the king of pop, Paul McCartney, was still holding out. The former Beatle hadn't performed live since John Lennon's death 5 years earlier.
He was an artistic recluse. He hadn't played, hadn't performed anywhere. He was having his family life. And Bob needed him badly for credibility. You know, one of the Beatles had to be in the show.
Pete Smith and production manager Andrew Zweck were told to go to McCartney's offices, as Geldof put it, to bag the lion.
There was a real sense of apprehension. You know, Friday night, 5 o'clock, you know, go get Paul McCartney.
So we all marched over to the office in Soho Square, very important, to discuss how the show was going to work. I was panicking. I had no idea how the show was going to work. And I was called upon to be the spokesman of how it was all going to be perfect and wonderful and technically professional and enhance Paul's career, and he'd play in a fantastic light. But I was making it up, it's the truth of it.
What if we go out there, you know, into Soho Square at 6 o'clock and he's said no, you know? I suppose you catch a train to Dover or something, you know? Because I'm not going back to see Harvey or Bob. But at the end of the meeting, he said, I was always going to do this show. You know? And I said, well, you know, why are you always going to do it? And he said, the management. So I said, Stephen Shrimpton, your manager? He said, no, Pete. Said, the management. So I thought, Linda? You know, so I said to him, oh, he said, who do you think the management is? And I said, the kids?
My kids were very keen on the whole thing. One or two of them were a little too small to be aware of it. But I think the thing about Live Aid was everyone who could be aware, who was conscious, was aware of it. It galvanised the nation.
With the last act in place, Andrew Zweck was finally free to concentrate on the greatest show on earth.
We sat there on the Sunday in an empty stadium, and sheer unadulterated panic set in. We had been neglecting this show, and suddenly it dawned on us how we were going to pull it off, how we were going to put on 25 bands on a strict timetable in a very limited physical space.
We're out of power in this stadium. We're drawing every amp that we've got here. We're fresh out of power. This is what Wembley Stadium have come this morning. They've said our plans to light the audience and so on. There's not an amp left in the place.
But can we just get more generators in?
Well, I've already got 3 out there. I'm already at 3 generators.
Get more, Andy, get more.
I remember panicking in the very start of the week with Bob, telling him, we haven't got enough of anything. There's not enough power here. We don't have the physical size to put all the bands on. There's no room to put all the artists. We haven't got enough catering. I haven't got enough staff. Where am I going to get it?
We're getting too big and spectacular. The resources are drying up.
Zweck's most pressing problem was another of Geldof's brainwaves, a revolving stage.
This is stage 1, 2 and 3. The reason it has to be like this is that it's unlike other pop shows. It's not when you go on, it's when you come off. Every band gets 20 minutes. We have to do that to fit in the appeal for money twice on the hour.
He knew it from some industrial trade show, which had abandoned it because it didn't work. But it was this large revolving turntable, very, very heavy, very unsuited for this purpose. We were absolutely flying by the seat of our pants. Once it was installed, it kept malfunctioning and it kept sinking into the wood because of its weight.
I
think my only concern was always whether this bloody stage would get stuck or not. And I said at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, you better get some horses in. What I meant was you better get lots and lots of people to physically turn the thing round.
I was going, you must be fucking joking, you know, underneath the bloody stage, you know.
Well, this was utter rubbish. Soon became a myth, because there was no room under that stage, even for a rat.
The horse was a big possibility. He was there, wasn't he?
If the stagehands were a bit clapped out, over at the BBC, things didn't seem much better.
SIO, EP 781.
It was like the 1940s. If they'd old pipes, it would have been perfect. They had a blackboard, and they'd drawn these little dots. Now, Sat 1 will go from here, and there'd all be these guys with beards and sort of sandals writing things down. At 400, 0400, we'd be there. And it really was like that, like a war room.
Give me stations bookings, please.
They presented this running order, and we laughed. We burst out laughing. They said at 1702, Sade would take the stage, and at 1917, The Who would come off. And we said, this is not how the music business works. This is not rock and roll. You're not going to tell The Who they have to leave the stage. You're not going to tell these artists what to do. And we laughed at the BBC.
With only days to go, America was still unravelling. Geldof badly needed the artists from We Are the World to give the show global credibility. A showdown took place between Ken Cragen, Mike Mitchell and Harvey Goldsmith.
We actually ended up all meeting together because there was a point where we suddenly felt we were being competitive. And I just wanted to get that out of the way really fast because that's the last thing we needed. It just wasn't on the agenda. So we had to sort out with them what they were trying to do because they were going to try and do their own concert.
With only 3 days to go, Ken Cragen struck a last-minute deal to appease the artists who were still holding out.
So when I got the call saying we're in, I sort of heaved a sigh of relief too, because the stories would have been where were they, rift between and all that stuff.
America was finally falling into place, but at Wembley, a massive row was brewing. Everyone in Britain was giving their services for free, except Wembley, who insisted on charging for the venue and their staff.
Wembley were the biggest pains in the arse of the whole thing. They were really not going with the plot. They wanted money, they wanted this, they wanted that. And like, I was just going, fuck them, you know, no.
An 11th hour meeting was arranged with Wembley's deputy chairman, Jarvis Astaire.
Suddenly, Bob Geldof let it rip and used a number of four-letter words.
Jarvis was starting to really dig his heels in, and the more he was digging his heels in, the more Bob was swearing, and the more Jarvis was getting seriously upset.
That man Geldof has just sworn at me then, and I said, so you've never met Bob before then? And he said, I'm not having it. I'm not having it in my boardroom. I was, to some extent, offended that he was in the boardroom at Wembley having a proper business meeting, and he was behaving like the wild ruffian that I thought he was in the first place.
It actually got very close to blows as it happened.
And I said to him, if you want to talk to me about an event at Wembley and you're here, don't use that language and don't bang on the table. And at that point, he was, it was like, I'm not having this, I'm not having this show in here, I'm not having that man in here. And we all thought it was all off again.
At the 24th hour, Wembley reached a deal. Live Aid agreed to pay the stadium £250,000 for the day. It wasn't just the big guns. In Cheshire, fruit and veg man Tony Butterworth was having his own battle with bureaucracy.
The main stumbling blocks were actually Macclesfield Borough Council, if I'm telling the truth, because they really didn't want it to be around here. They were absolutely sure that the hippie convoy was going to arrive from Stonehenge, and there's going to be dirt, dust and other unsavoury activities. We had to go the following day, to the town hall, and the place was full of people objecting, and there was an old lady, right? She looked like Mrs. Marples, you know, big coat on and a portmanteau, and and she was sat right at the back, and I kept turning around and looking at her like, you know, and I thought, oh, she's trouble. Anyway, it came to the end of the sort of summing up, and I saw a woman at the back stuck her hand up, you know. I thought, oh, this is it. And she said, I just want to say there are people dying right now as we speak. And she picked her bag up and went, and she walked past me and went. And these 3 judges said, there's your licence, you know.
One day to go, and the stars were wheeled out onto the BBC to promote the show, while along the corridor, the foot soldiers were receiving their marching orders.
We were given no guidance at all about the kind of programme that was wanted. We didn't know whether we were covering an event or participating in it.
Absolutely no preparation and absolutely no rehearsal at all. I mean, I can remember being called to a meeting, but mostly it was just lots of technical johnnies from the kind of outside broadcasting, talking about, you know, miles of cables that they were going to use and satellite links and all sorts of rather butch-sounding technology. We were kind of just gibbering in the middle of it.
We were all given little folders with the running order and show up. That's all you could do, show up.
It was as amateur and as shambolic as that.
But one man was more than relieved to see the BBC vans roll into Wembley.
BBC marching with their clipboards, and they've got this running order, and they said, this is how it's going to be. It's all going to work like clockwork. We're going to interface with Philadelphia. And I thought, well, I believe them now. You know, in the beginning, I thought this was pie in the sky. But once they arrived on site, team-handed with all of the staff and all of the clipboards and all of the equipment, I thought, hang on, I'm not alone here.
Then, the time came to try out the stage.
The one dry run we got, because time was running out, it did fail, and panic set in, and then we called in volunteers. We called everybody we could find in London. Please come and help.
It was completely like Keystone Cops. You had big, burly men running around with amps, getting stuck in the middle of the stage, turning, people still trying to plug out and seeing wires all crossed, things falling over.
Is that the familiar face of Janice Long? Janice, how's it going?
Things are going really well down here at Wembley. We've just missed...
I remember having to be, well, lying, basically, to Terry. You know, no, it's all fine, it's all going to be hunky-dory. You could feel the panic, because there was no way that stage was going to go anywhere.
We panicked, as usual.
It would be a long night for Bob Geldof. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he was awoken by a phone call. U2 wanted to pull out of the show.
We probably threw a wobbler, because we weren't getting a sound check. That would be very like us. Yeah.
I don't remember that.
I do remember trouble over a sound check, yeah.
Geldof, by now exhausted after weeks of sleepless nights, spat out his familiar response.
Fuck 'em.
Stay right here. Part 2 coming up next.